Hi guys, tonight we're stepping away from the famous stories, away from the battles, the crowns, and the names history chose to remember. Instead, we're looking at the medieval world as it actually felt for most people. Slow, quiet, repetitive, a life made of ordinary days that rarely changed. This is not a story about heroes. There are no turning points here, no dramatic moments meant to be remembered, just routines, small discomforts, and habits repeated so often that they became invisible. Tonight, we'll explore the medieval world not as history books describe it, but as it was lived one uneventful day at a time. So get comfortable, let your mind slow down, and let's begin. A quiet world we think we know, but rarely question. The medieval world often arrives in our imagination, already complete. It feels familiar before we ever examine it. Stone castles rise on distant hills. Church bells echo across small villages. Farmers move slowly through open fields, following the same patterns their parents once did. It is a world that appears simple, orderly, and strangely calm. And because it feels familiar, we rarely stop to question it. Most people picture the Middle Ages as a time defined by its grand features: tall walls, heavy armor, kings and queens, battles that reshaped borders. These images are repeated so often that they begin to feel like the whole story. They settle into our minds quietly, forming a background we accept without resistance. But familiarity has a way of hiding complexity. For most medieval people, life was not shaped by castles or wars. It was shaped by routine, by repetition, by small, unremarkable decisions made each morning, and the slow acceptance that tomorrow would look much like today. Their world was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, predictable, and in many ways invisible. This is the medieval world we think we know but rarely question. The quietness of medieval life did not mean peace. It meant limitation. Most people lived within a narrow radius for their entire lives. A village, a field, a workshop, a church. The same paths were walked again and again until the ground itself remembered the shape of their feet. News arrived slowly. If it arrived at all, change was rare, and when it came, it often felt confusing rather than exciting. Time moved differently here. Without clocks to divide the day, life followed natural signals: light and darkness, hunger and exhaustion. The changing seasons mattered more than dates or years. For many people, age was not measured precisely. Childhood faded into adulthood without ceremony. Old age arrived gradually, often unnoticed until the body could no longer keep pace with habit. This slowness shaped how people understood the world. There was little expectation of progress. Tomorrow was not imagined as better or worse only as another version of today. Survival depended less on ambition and more on endurance. And yet, when we look back, we often project our own expectations onto this world. We imagine medieval people constantly aware that they were living in a harsh and dangerous time. But for those within it, hardship was not always dramatic. It was normal. Hunger did not announce itself as tragedy. It arrived quietly, as smaller meals, thinner bodies, and familiar discomfort. Illness did not come with explanations. It came as an accepted part of life, often endured without protest, because there was little alternative. The quiet medieval world was not defined by constant fear. It was defined by acceptance. This acceptance is difficult for modern minds to understand. We are trained to look for disruption, for moments of change, for turning points that separate one era from another. But medieval life was not experienced in chapters. It flowed continuously, rarely offering clear beginnings or endings. Most people never expected their lives to be remembered. Their days were not lived with an audience in mind. They worked because work was required. They followed customs because customs provided structure. They obeyed authority, not always out of loyalty, but because questioning it felt pointless. And this is where our misunderstanding begins. When we study the Middle Ages, we often focus on the exceptional, on the dramatic, on the figures who disrupted the quiet flow of everyday life. Kings who ruled, revolts that failed or succeeded, plagues that reshaped populations. These events mattered, but they did not define daily experience in the way we often assume. For most people, history happened somewhere else. It happened in distant cities, in royal courts they would never see, in documents they could not read. Their own lives continued quietly alongside these events, shaped far more by weather, soil, and routine than by politics. Even belief itself was quiet. Faith was not always dramatic or deeply questioned. It was woven into daily habit, prayers spoken because they had always been spoken. Rituals followed because they marked time. For many, belief was less about conviction and more about continuity. It offered structure in a world that rarely explained itself. The medieval world did not constantly ask people to reflect on their place in history. It asked them to endure, and endurance leaves little trace. This is why so much of medieval life feels distant to us. Not because it was alien, but because it was ordinary. Ordinary lives do not leave behind monuments. They leave behind patterns, repetitive and easy to overlook. We inherit a version of the Middle Ages, shaped by what survived. Stone walls outlasted wooden homes. Written records favored the powerful. What remains creates the illusion that medieval life was defined by what was exceptional, but beneath that surface existed a quieter reality. A world of people who woke early, worked until tired, ate what was available, and slept without expecting tomorrow to be different. A world where personal dreams were often small, practical, and shaped by immediate needs rather than distant possibilities. This is not a world that invites easy judgment. It does not ask to be admired or condemned. It simply existed, sustained by repetition and necessity. And perhaps that is why we rarely question it, because a quiet world does not demand attention. It does not shock us. It does not entertain. It moves slowly, asking only to be endured. And when we look back, we are tempted to look past it toward louder stories that feel more meaningful. But if we want to understand the medieval world as it was actually lived, we must begin here. Not with kings or battles, but with the silence between events. With the long stretches of time where nothing remarkable happened, yet life continued all the same. This is the medieval world we think we know, and it is only just beginning to reveal itself. Life between the castles, where most people actually lived. When people imagine the medieval world, they often begin with castles. Stone walls rising above the land, towers visible from miles away, strongholds that seem to dominate the landscape and define the age. These structures feel permanent, powerful, and central to the story. But most medieval people never lived inside them. For the vast majority of the population, castles were distant landmarks rather than they were places seen from afar, passed occasionally on the road, or spoken about in rumors and obligations. Life did not unfold within thick stone walls. It unfolded in the spaces between them. This was where medieval life truly existed. Villages were small, loosely organized, and deeply tied to the land around them. Homes were built close together, often from wood, mud, and straw materials that left little trace behind. Roofs were low, interiors were dark. Smoke from cooking fires lingered in the air, slowly blackening the walls over time. Privacy was rare, so was silence. Daily life happened in shared spaces. Families slept in the same rooms where they cooked and worked. Animals were often kept close, sometimes indoors, especially during colder months. The line between human and animal life was thin, shaped by necessity rather than preference. These were not places designed for comfort. They were designed for survival. Most villages existed because the land allowed them to. Fields stretched outward from clusters of homes, divided not by fences, but by habit and agreement. Everyone knew which land belonged to whom, not because it was clearly marked, but because it had always been that way. Boundaries were remembered, not recorded. The rhythm of life here was slow and repetitive. Work began early, guided by daylight rather than schedules. Tasks changed with the seasons but rarely with the years. Plowing, planting, harvesting, repairing, tools, carrying water, preparing food that was simple, filling, and familiar. Meals were eaten not for pleasure, but for energy. This was life between the castles far removed from the symbols of power that dominate historical memory. Authority was present, but often abstract. Lords and landowners might live miles away. Their influence was felt through obligations, rent, labor, taxes, or service. For many villagers, power existed as expectation rather than constant supervision. Rules were followed because defiance offered little reward. Protection was not guaranteed. Castles were built to defend territory, not people. In times of conflict, villagers might be left to protect themselves or flee if they could. The walls that symbolized security were not always open to those who lived nearest to them. And yet, life continued. People formed communities not out of choice, but out of necessity. Cooperation was essential. Tools were shared. Labor was exchanged. Survival depended on mutual reliance, even when relationships were strained. Disagreements happened quietly and were often resolved locally, without record or ceremony. The medieval village was not a romantic place, but it was a functional one. Homes were crowded, but they were familiar. Paths were muddy, but they were known. The landscape itself became a form of memory. Trees, wells, and worn roads marked time more reliably than dates ever could. Children grew up quickly here. From an early age, they observed work and were expected to participate when able. There was little separation between learning and labor. Skills were absorbed through repetition rather than instruction. Mistakes were corrected through necessity, not patience. The idea of childhood as a protected phase of life did not exist in the way we understand it today. Youth blended gradually into responsibility, often without clear transition. By adolescence, many were already fully involved in sustaining the household. And still, castles loomed in the background. They served as reminders of a larger world, one defined by hierarchy and power. But that world rarely intersected with daily village life in visible ways. Decisions were made elsewhere. Conflicts began elsewhere. The consequences arrived quietly, often delayed and confusing. For villagers, history felt distant. It arrived not as grand announcements, but as subtle changes. A new tax, a different obligation, a rumor carried by these shifts were absorbed into daily routine, becoming just another burden to manage rather than a moment of transformation. Life between the castles was shaped by limits. Opportunities were narrow. Movement was restricted by obligation and survival needs. Most people remained where they were born, not because they lacked curiosity, but because leaving required resources and permission they did not have. And yet, within these limits, people found stability. Routine offered predictability. Familiar work provided structure. Relationships, even difficult ones, created a sense of belonging. In a world with little choice, familiarity itself became a form of comfort. This is where medieval life truly unfolded, not in halls of stone, but in modest homes that no longer exist, in fields that were worked until the soil grew tired, in communities that left behind few written records, but sustained entire societies through repetition and resilience. When we focus too closely on castles, we miss this world entirely. We miss the lives lived quietly beyond the walls, the people who formed the foundation of medieval society without ever stepping into the spaces history prefers to remember. And it is from this overlooked landscape that the rest of the medieval story slowly emerges through routine, labor, and the unnoticed persistence of ordinary lives. The slow rhythm of days without clocks or urgency in the medieval world. Time did not dominate life the way it does today. There were no glowing numbers on walls, no alarms to interrupt sleep, no schedules dividing the day into precise segments. For most people, time was not something measured, it was something felt. The day began when light entered the room. Morning was announced by brightness rather than sound. As the sky shifted from darkness to pale gray, households slowly stirred. There was no rush to be anywhere specific at a specific moment. Work began when it could, not when it was scheduled. The body, not the clock, decided when the day truly started. This absence of urgency shaped everything. Tasks unfolded at the pace allowed by tools, weather, and strength. If rain fell, work changed. If exhaustion arrived early, effort slowed. There was little expectation that time could be controlled or optimized. It simply passed, carrying people with it. The medieval day was long, but not fast. Without precise hours, the day was divided loosely. Morning, midday, evening, night. These were not fixed periods, but flexible states. Midday arrived when the sun was highest. Evening began when shadows grew long. Night came when work was no longer possible. Church bells sometimes marked these transitions, but even they were bells did not demand punctuality. They offered orientation, a general sense of where one stood within the flow of the day. Time was communal rather than personal. People moved together through the day, guided by shared rhythms. Fields filled with workers at roughly the same time. Meals were taken when work paused, not when a clock dictated. Rest came when darkness settled, not when productivity goals were met. There was no sense of being behind. If a task took longer than expected, it simply took longer. If something remained unfinished, it would wait. Tomorrow was not seen as a failure or delay, it was a continuation. Life was not structured around deadlines, but around endurance. This slowness did not mean ease. Days were physically demanding. Labor required constant movement and effort. Bodies grew tired quickly, especially during planting and harvest seasons. But fatigue was not framed as something to overcome efficiently. It was accepted as part of the process. There was no expectation of acceleration. In a world without clocks, urgency rarely existed. Emergencies happened, of course, storms, illness, accidents, but daily life did not operate under constant pressure. The idea that every moment must be maximized would have felt foreign. Time was not something to manage. It was something to live inside. Even waiting felt different. Waiting was common and unremarkable. Waiting for weather to change. Waiting for food to cook. Waiting for daylight. Waiting for seasons to turn. These pauses were not viewed as interruptions. They were part of the natural order. Patience was not a virtue, it was a necessity. Without fast communication or rapid transport, responses were slow. Questions went unanswered for weeks or months. Decisions unfolded gradually. The future was not planned in detail because it could not be controlled in detail. Life unfolded one moment at a time. This rhythm shaped how people thought. Without constant reminders of time passing, awareness of age was less precise. Birthdays were rarely recorded. Years blended together. People remembered events, not by date, but by circumstance. Before a bad winter, after a harvest failed, during a certain lord's rule. Memory followed experience, not numbers. Children learned this rhythm early. They watched adults work steadily rather than urgently. They absorbed the idea that effort mattered more than speed. Mistakes were corrected slowly, through repetition rather than instruction. There was no sense that time was slipping away. This does not mean medieval people lacked awareness of mortality. Death was present, often uncomfortably so. But the awareness of death did not translate into haste. Instead, it encouraged acceptance. Life was finite, but it moved at its own pace. Rushing would not change the outcome. Even travel reflected this mindset. Journeys were slow and unpredictable. Roads were poor. Distances felt larger. A trip of a few miles could take most of a day. People left early, expecting delays. Arrival times were approximate, not promised. No one expected perfect timing. The absence of clocks meant the absence of synchronization. People did not coordinate across distances with precision. Communities functioned locally, each following its own rhythm. What mattered was presence, not punctuality. This created a world that felt smaller but more grounded. The slow rhythm also shaped emotional life. Without constant stimulation or deadlines, feelings had space to settle. Boredom existed, but it was not feared. Silence was common. Long stretches of routine allowed thoughts to wander without direction. Reflection happened quietly, if at all. There was little pressure to fill every moment. Doing nothing was not considered wasteful, it was unavoidable. Darkness forced rest, weather imposed pauses. The world itself limited activity, and people adapted accordingly. Time belonged to the environment, not the individual. Even conflict moved slowly. Disputes unfolded over weeks or seasons. Resolutions were delayed. Consequences were gradual. There was rarely a sense of immediate closure. Life continued alongside unresolved tensions, absorbing them into daily routine. Urgency was rare because urgency offered no advantage. The medieval sense of time was shaped by cycles rather than lines. Days repeated, seasons returned, work followed, patterns that had existed for generations. Change was measured not in moments, but in lifetimes. Progress was not expected within a single day. This cyclical understanding made the future feel distant and abstract. Planning beyond the next season was difficult. Hope was modest. Expectations were limited. Life was lived close to the present, not because people lacked imagination, but because circumstances demanded focus on what was immediate. The slow rhythm did not inspire ambition. It inspired persistence. People endured because endurance was rewarded. Those who could maintain effort, adapt to fatigue, and accept delay were more likely to survive. Speed offered no advantage in a world that resisted. It taught, and so the days continued. Morning light, work, meals, rest, darkness, repeated so often that individual days blurred together. Memory softened the edges. Life felt continuous rather than segmented. This is difficult for modern minds to grasp. We live by schedules, deadlines, and constant reminders of time passing. We feel pressure where medieval people felt routine. We rush where they waited. We measure success by efficiency, not endurance. And yet, this slow rhythm defined medieval existence more than any event or invention. It shaped how people worked, rested, learned, and aged. It framed expectations and limited possibility. It made life feel stable, even when it was difficult. And as this rhythm continued, quietly and persistently, it shaped something else as well. The way silence settled into daily life, the way pauses became normal, and the way absence of urgency created spaces that were rarely filled with words. Spaces that will begin to matter even more as we move deeper into the medieval world. Why silence was a normal part of medieval life. Silence in the medieval world was not unusual. It was not something people sought, and it was not something they feared. It simply existed, woven naturally into daily life. For modern ears, silence often feels uncomfortable. We are surrounded by sound, voices, engines, notifications, constant background noise. Quiet feels empty, even unsettling. But for medieval people, silence was familiar. It was a space between necessary sounds, and it filled most of the day. Much of medieval life unfolded without words. Work was often done quietly. Fields did not require conversation. Repetitive tasks demanded focus more than discussion. Hands moved while thoughts drifted. The sounds that filled these moments were not human voices, but tools striking earth, fabric rubbing against wood, footsteps pressing into soil. Speech was practical, not constant. People spoke when information needed to be exchanged. Instructions were brief. Corrections were direct. Stories were told, but not endlessly. There was no expectation that silence needed to be filled. When nothing needed to be said, nothing was said. This was not loneliness. It was normal. Homes were quiet places as well. Interiors were small, dark, and often filled with smoke. Sound did not travel far. Conversations stayed close. Children learned early to listen rather than interrupt. Loudness was not encouraged, it drew attention and wasted energy. At night, silence deepened. Once darkness fell, activity slowed. Candles were expensive. Firewood was limited. Movement became minimal. Families settled into rest, not with entertainment, but with stillness. The world outside faded into darkness, and sound faded with it. Silence marked the end of the day. Even communal spaces were quieter than we might expect. Villages were not constantly filled with chatter. People passed one another regularly, but greetings were brief. Familiarity reduced the need for words. Everyone already knew who belonged and what was expected. There was little to explain. Information traveled slowly, and so did conversation. News was rare enough to matter when it arrived. Most days offered nothing new to discuss. The absence of novelty made silence easier to accept. This quietness shaped emotional life. Without constant conversation or distraction, feelings lingered. Thoughts repeated themselves. Worries were carried quietly rather than shared openly. There was little language for emotional exploration and little space for it in daily routine. Pain was endured privately. Grief did not always come with dramatic displays. Loss was common enough to be expected. When death occurred, it was acknowledged, rituals were observed, and life continued. Silence followed, not because people felt nothing, but because words did not change reality. The medieval world did not encourage expression for its own sake. Faith contributed to this silence. Prayer was often silent or spoken softly. Reflection was internal. Confession, when it occurred, was structured and limited. Religion provided explanations, but not conversation. Belief was practiced quietly, embedded in habit rather than debate. Churches themselves were places of controlled sound. Voices echoed, but moments of quiet were common. Silence carried meaning. It signaled reverence, obedience, and acceptance. Words were not seen as tools for shaping reality. They described what already existed. The absence of widespread literacy reinforced this. Many people could not read or write. Knowledge was transmitted through observation, memory, and repetition. Ideas were absorbed slowly, without constant verbal reinforcement. Silence supported memory, without written records to rely on. People remembered through familiarity. Paths, routines, and seasons became references. Knowledge lived in the body as much as the mind. Speaking was less important than doing. Children learned within this quiet framework. They watched more than they asked. Questions were answered when necessary, but curiosity was shaped by practicality. Learning happened through imitation. Silence allowed attention. Noise distracted from survival. Even conflict was quieter. Arguments happened, but they were brief and contained. Disputes were resolved through authority or compromise, not extended debate. Loud confrontation risked drawing unwanted attention. Silence was safer. The medieval world valued restraint. This does not mean it lacked emotion. It means emotion was managed differently. Without constant outlets, feelings were absorbed into routine. Frustration became fatigue. Hope became endurance. Joy became brief moments of rest. Silence held these emotions without naming them. The landscape itself encouraged quiet. Fields stretched wide and empty. Forests absorbed sound. Villages were small islands of activity surrounded by space. Wind, rain, and birds replaced human noise. Nature did not compete for attention, it simply existed. People adapted to this environment. They learned to listen, to notice subtle changes, to recognize danger through absence as much as presence. Silence was informative. It told them when something was wrong. An unexpected noise mattered because silence was the norm. This quiet also limited imagination. Without constant stimulation, thought stayed close to immediate concerns. Fantasies were shaped by tradition and belief rather than invention. Stories were repeated, not reinvented. Creativity existed, but it moved slowly. Silence preserved continuity. Generations lived similar lives because there was little to disrupt. The pattern. Quiet reinforced repetition. Repetition created stability, and stability mattered. In a world without guarantees, predictability offered comfort. Silence signaled that things were as expected. No alarms, no announcements, just the familiar absence of change. When silence was broken, it was noticed. Bells rang for important reasons. Cries signaled danger. Loud gatherings marked celebration or crises. Sound carried meaning precisely because it was rare. Most days, silence returned quickly. This rhythm of quiet shaped how medieval people experienced time, work, and one another. It slowed perception. It reduced urgency. It made patience unavoidable. Silence was not a luxury. It was the default condition of life. And within that silence, people learned to exist without constant reassurance. They endured uncertainty without explanation. They accepted repetition without complaint. The medieval world did not ask people to speak constantly. It asked them to listen to the land, to their bodies, to the limits imposed by circumstance. This quietness is difficult to imagine today, not because it was extreme, but because it was ordinary. Silence did not signal absence. It signaled normality. And as we move deeper into medieval life, this silence will begin to interact with something else, with hunger, with routine, and with the simple, repetitive acts that define survival itself. Acts centered around one of the most basic needs of all. Food that was simple, repetitive, and never guaranteed. Food in the medieval world was not a source of excitement. It was a necessity, managed with caution, routine, and quiet uncertainty. Meals were not planned around preference or variety, but around availability. What people ate was determined less by choice and more by circumstance. For most medieval people, food was simple because it had to be. The daily diet was repetitive. Bread formed the foundation of nearly every meal. It was eaten in the morning, at midday, and again in the evening. Made from whatever grain was available, often barley, rye, or oats. It was dense, filling, and rarely refined. The quality of bread varied from season to season and from household to household, but it was always present when anything else was. When bread was missing, everything felt unstable. Alongside bread came potaja, thick stew, made from grains, vegetables, and occasionally small amounts of meat or fat. Ingredients were added when available and removed when they were not. Recipes did not exist. Each pot reflected circumstance rather than intention. Meals tasted familiar because they were familiar. Flavor was not a priority. Spices were expensive and rare. Salt was valuable and carefully rationed. Most food tasted plain, earthy, and consistent. Variety was a luxury enjoyed by few and rarely expected by anyone. Eating was functional. Meals were taken when work paused, not when hunger demanded. Portions were measured by need rather than desire. People ate enough to continue working, not enough to feel satisfied. Fullness was temporary. Hunger was familiar. This relationship with food shaped daily behavior. People thought about food constantly, because they enjoyed it, but because it could not be taken for granted. Supplies were counted, stores were monitored. A poor harvest or a harsh winter could reduce meals slowly and quietly, long before starvation became visible. Food disappeared gradually. There was rarely a clear moment when abundance turned into scarcity. Instead, portions grew smaller. Ingredients were stretched. Meals were thinned with water. Bread became darker, heavier, and less filling. These changes were accepted silently, without panic, because they were expected. The medieval world did not promise consistency. Harvests depended on weather. Whether a single storm could undo months of labor. Cold summers, excessive rain, or early frosts could reduce yields dramatically. When crops failed, there was no replacement system. There were no reserves beyond what households and communities managed themselves. Food security was local and fragile. Markets existed, but access was limited. Travel required time and resources. Prices fluctuated quickly in times of shortage. For many people, purchasing extra food was impossible. They relied on what they had grown or stored. This uncertainty shaped social behavior. Food was shared cautiously. Generosity existed, but it had limits. Helping a neighbor meant reducing one's own reserves. Decisions were made carefully, balancing community obligation against survival. Hunger tested relationships. Meat was rare for most people. When animals were slaughtered, it was often for specific reasons: free surveillance, preservation needs, or necessity. Meat was stretched over multiple meals, preserved when possible, and never wasted. Fat, bones, and organs were used fully. Nothing edible was discarded lightly. Vegetables provided some variety, but even they followed seasons strictly. What grew locally determined what was eaten. When fresh food disappeared, preserved food took its place. Drying, salting, and fermenting extended survival, not pleasure. The taste of winter was different. Cold months brought heavier, blander meals. Freshness was replaced by food sustained life, but offered little comfort. Eating became an act of maintenance rather than enjoyment. And yet, people adapted. They learned to tolerate monotony. They adjusted expectations. Children grew up eating the same foods repeatedly, rarely questioning the absence of alternatives. What was available became normal. This repetition shaped memory. People remembered years by their harvests. A good year, a bad year, a year when bread was scarce. Food became a marker of time, more reliable than dates or events. Scarcity did not always announce itself dramatically. There were no immediate signs that food would run out. Hunger crept in slowly, becoming part of daily sensation. People learned to ignore it, to work through it, to sleep with it. The body adjusted, even when it should not have had to. Food was also tied to hierarchy. Those with land or power ate better. Their meals were more varied, their tables more secure, but even wealth did not guarantee abundance. Shortages affected everyone, though unequally. Privilege softened hunger, but did not eliminate uncertainty. The distance between abundance and scarcity was narrow. Religious practices reinforced this relationship with food. Fasting was common. Abstinence was encouraged. Hunger was framed as spiritually meaningful. This did not reduce physical discomfort, but it provided a narrative that made endurance easier. Hunger was not always seen as failure. It was sometimes seen as discipline, or simply as fate. Complaints changed nothing. Acceptance reduced tension. Meals were often eaten quietly. Conversation was limited. Eating was brief. Food was consumed efficiently, without ceremony. There was little reason to linger. When meals ended, work resumed. Food structured the day without dominating it. The act of eating was not an event, it was a pause. And always, beneath routine, there was uncertainty. No one assumed that tomorrow's meal was guaranteed. No one expected consistency across seasons. Life was organized around managing risk rather than eliminating it. This uncertainty shaped behavior, subtly, but persistently. People stored food when possible. They conserved when necessary. They learned which foods could be stretched and which could not. Knowledge was passed quietly, through practice rather than instruction. Food was learned, not taught. Children observed how adults managed scarcity. They learned to eat slowly, to accept small portions, to value leftovers. Appetite was controlled by expectation. Waste was unthinkable. Even celebration reflected this restraint. Festivals included richer food, but excess was temporary. Abundance was enjoyed cautiously, aware that it would not last. Food did not promise happiness, it promised survival, and survival required patience. The medieval relationship with food was shaped not by taste, but by repetition and uncertainty. Meals repeated because options were limited. Scarcity lingered because control was impossible. This constant negotiation with hunger shaped bodies, habits, and expectations. It taught endurance without optimism. And as food remained simple, repetitive, and never guaranteed, it influenced something deeper as well: the way people feared the future, the way seasons were watched anxiously, and the quiet dread that arrived each year as the days grew shorter. A dread that centered not on what was lost, but on what might not return. The unspoken fear of winter and empty storehouses. Winter in the medieval world was not imagined as a season of beauty or rest. It was approached quietly, with calculation and restraint. Long before the first frost appeared, winter was already present in people's thoughts, not spoken of openly, but felt in decisions made months earlier. The fear of winter was rarely dramatic. It did not announce itself with panic or preparation scenes. It settled in slowly, woven into routine, shaping behavior without demanding attention. People watched the harvest closely. Grain was measured not by abundance, but by sufficiency. Every bundle of wheat, every sack of barley, every stored root carried a silent question. Would this be enough? The answer would not arrive until months later, when there was nothing left to do but wait. Storehouses became symbols of survival. They were checked repeatedly, not obsessively, but habitually. People learned the weight of sacks by touch. They noticed when piles seemed smaller than expected. These observations were rarely shared openly. Speaking fear aloud did not increase supplies. Silence made fear manageable. Winter was long. Once it arrived, movement slowed. Fields lay empty. Roads became difficult or impossible to travel. Communities turned inward. What had been stored was all that remained between survival and hunger. There were no second chances. If stores ran low, there was no alternative source to turn to. Markets could not be relied upon. Travel was risky. Aid from outside was uncertain and often unavailable. Each household faced winter largely on its own. Cold amplified scarcity. Bodies required more energy to stay warm. Food that might have been sufficient in warmer months now felt inadequate. Hunger became sharper, more persistent. Meals were stretched further, portions shrank. People noticed, but rarely complained. Children felt winter differently. Their bodies were smaller, their reach limited. They felt hunger sooner, cold, more deeply. Parents responded quietly, adjusting portions, offering reassurance without explanation. Fear was not transferred through words, but through observation. Children learned by watching. They saw adults conserve energy. Movement slowed. Work was reduced to what was necessary. Fires were tended carefully. Light was rationed. Winter forced restraint in every aspect of life. The house became a place of waiting. Days were shorter. Darkness arrived early and stayed longer. Activity retreated into confined spaces. Smoke lingered. Air grew heavy. Time stretched. Winter tested endurance more than strength. Illness spread more easily during these months. Bodies, weakened by limited nutrition, struggled to recover. Minor sicknesses became serious. Death, already familiar, felt closer, and still. People endured quietly. The fear of winter was not loud because it was expected. Every year brought the same uncertainty. Survival depended on acceptance rather than resistance. Hope was cautious. People did not expect winter to be kind. They hoped only that it would be survivable. Expectations were modest, shaped by memory of previous years. A good winter was one that ended. Storehouses emptied gradually. The rhythm was familiar. Early winter still felt manageable. Supplies seemed adequate. Midwinter brought awareness. Late winter brought anxiety. The final weeks were the hardest, when stores were low and spring still distant. This period was known quietly. People recognized it without naming it. Behavior changed subtly. Meals were thinner. Rest increased. Effort was conserved. Conversation remained minimal. Fear expressed itself through restraint. There was little room for optimism. Spring was imagined, but not relied upon. Too many winters had ended badly. Survival was not assumed. It was hoped for carefully. Communities adapted collectively. Support existed, but it was limited. Sharing was cautious. Those with more helped when they could, but generosity could not override scarcity. Hard decisions were made quietly, without ceremony. Winter exposed inequality. Some households endured more comfortably than others. Wealth softened hardship, but did not eliminate it. Even those with resources watched supplies closely. Winter respected no status entirely. Faith offered explanation, not relief. Cold and hunger were framed as trials. Endurance was praised. Suffering was given meaning, even when it could not be alleviated. This framing did not feel but it offered a way to accept emptiness. Silence returned often, with fewer tasks to fill the day. People spent long hours waiting for light, waiting for warmth, waiting for time to pass, waiting for the first signs of thaw. Winter slowed thaw as much as movement. Memories of warmer months faded. The world felt reduced to immediate. The future narrowed. To the next meal, the next day, time became heavy. The absence of change made days blend together. Without variation, winter felt endless, yet each day mattered. Survival became cumulative. People counted days not by marking them, but by enduring them. Each morning arrived quietly, without promise. Each night was accepted with relief. Fear was managed through habit. Routines were maintained even when they felt unnecessary. Familiar actions provided structure. Structure reduced anxiety. Winter was faced not with preparation alone, but with repetition. This endurance shaped character. People learned patience not as a virtue, but as a requirement. They learned to tolerate discomfort without resolution. They learned to live with uncertainty without expecting. Explanation. Winter was not a test meant to be passed. It was a condition meant to be survived. The fear of empty storehouses lingered even after winter ended. Memory carried it forward. It influenced how people approached the next harvest, how much they stored, how little they wasted. Scarcity taught restraint long after abundance returned. This cycle repeated year after year. Fear never disappeared. It simply changed form. It softened during warmer months, then sharpened again as days shortened. Winter taught medieval people that survival depended not on certainty, but on adaptation. It reinforced humility. No matter how well prepared one felt, winter reminded everyone of their limits. Nature dictated terms. Human effort responded. This relationship shaped worldview. Life was not seen as controllable. It was negotiated. Each year brought familiar challenges, and endurance was the measure of success. And as winter pressed in and storehouses emptied, it influenced not only hunger and fear, but the way people related to their surroundings, to their homes, to the dirt beneath their feet, and to the physical environment that shaped every aspect of existence and environment. That was far less clean, far more persistent, and far more present than we often imagine. How dirt, mud, and smoke shaped everyday existence. The medieval world was not clean, not by neglect, and not by choice, by condition. Dirt was everywhere, and it was unavoidable. It covered roads, clung to clothing, settled into homes, and followed people through every part of their day. Cleanliness, as we understand it now, was not a realistic goal. Life unfolded in close contact with earth, animals, and fire, and the traces of each remained visible. Mud defined movement. Roads were unpaved. Paths were shaped by repeated footsteps rather than design. When rain fell, the ground softened, held water. Shoes sank. Carts struggled. Travel slowed to a crawl. Mud was not an inconvenience, was a condition that shaped distance and effort, that villages adapted to it. People learned where the ground held firm and where it did not. Certain. Certain paths were avoided during wet seasons. Travel was planned around weather. Clothing was chosen not for appearance, but for endurance. Mud was brushed away when possible, and ignored when it was not. It followed people indoors. Homes did little to separate interior from exterior. Floors were often packed earth, occasionally covered with straw or rushes. These coverings absorbed moisture, dirt, and waste. They were replaced periodically, but never eliminated the presence of earth within living space. Clean boundaries did not exist. Animals contributed to this environment. Livestock moved through shared spaces. Manure was common and valuable, collected for use in fields. Smells lingered. Flies were expected. These conditions were not shocking, they were familiar. People adapted their senses accordingly. What would feel overwhelming today was normalized then. The human body adjusted. Awareness shifted. Dirt became background rather than focus. Smoke was equally present. Most homes relied on open hearths for cooking and warmth. Chimneys were rare or ineffective. Smoke filled rooms slowly, drifting upward before escaping through gaps in the roof or walls. It settled into hair, clothing, and lungs. Breathing was never entirely clean. Eyes burned. Throats felt raw. Over time, smoke became part of the body's environment. People coughed without comment. Discomfort was accepted as routine. The smell of smoke marked time. It was present in the morning, at midday, and in the evening. It clung to people as they moved through the village. It connected homes to one another through shared atmosphere. This constant exposure shaped health. Respiratory problems were common, though rarely understood. Irritation was endured without explanation. There were no words for chronic conditions. Symptoms existed without diagnosis. The medieval body adapted because it had no alternative. Mud and smoke-shaped work. As well. Fields turned heavy with rain, tools clogged with earth. Hands remained dirty despite effort. Washing was limited by water availability and temperature. Cleanliness required time and energy that could rarely be spared. Hands were rarely clean. Food was prepared in these conditions. Dirt was brushed away when possible. Smoke flavored meals unintentionally. Standards of hygiene were practical rather than ideal. Illness was attributed to fate or imbalance, not environment. Life did not pause for cleanliness. Clothing reflected this reality. Garments were worn repeatedly, repaired often, and washed infrequently. Fabric absorbed dirt and smoke until it became part of its texture. Clean clothes were a sign of occasion, not daily expectation. People recognized one another by wear. The appearance of clothing told stories of work done, of seasons past, of endurance rather than neglect. Homes themselves aged quickly. Wood darkened from smoke. Walls absorbed moisture. Floors shifted. Repairs were constant but temporary. Homes were not built to last generations. They were built to serve immediate need. Permanence was rare. This environment shaped behavior subtly. People moved carefully. They learned to step around puddles, to avoid certain areas after rain, to position themselves away from smoke when possible. Small adjustments accumulated into habit. Awareness replaced comfort. Children grew up within this physical reality. They played in dirt without concern. They breathed smoky air without complaint. Their bodies adapted early. What would feel harsh to outsiders felt normal to them. The environment trained resilience. This closeness to dirt also shaped perception of cleanliness and impurity. Dirt was not inherently negative. It was associated with work, with productivity, with survival. Cleanliness was appreciated, but not expected. Effort mattered more than appearance. Judgment focused elsewhere. Mud and smoke blurred distinctions between spaces. There was little separation between work and rest, between public and private, between clean and dirty. Life flowed through overlapping environments that shared the same physical conditions. Boundaries were social, not physical. Even religious spaces were not immune. Churches smelled of damp stone, smoke from candles, and bodies gathered closely. Floors were walked upon by many. Silence, rather than cleanliness, marked sacredness. Reverence was felt, not seen. The presence of dirt reinforced humility. People were reminded daily of their physical limits. The environment resisted control. Effort did not guarantee comfort. Adaptation mattered more than improvement. This shaped worldview. The world was not expected to become easier. It was expected to be endured. Progress was not a goal, it was a rare accident. Mud returned after every rain. Smoke returned with every fire. There was no final solution. People accepted this cycle. They did not imagine a cleaner future. They managed the present. Small improvements were welcomed, but not relied upon. Stability mattered more than change. This physical environment also influenced smell. Odors were constant and layered. Earth, animals, smoke, food. People learned to distinguish important smells spoiling food. Illness, danger from background, scent. Smell became information. Silence, dirt, and smoke worked together. They created a world that demanded attention without explanation. People learned through experience rather than instruction. Knowledge lived in habit, not theory. The medieval environment trained the senses differently. Touch, smell, and sight mattered more than abstract understanding. The body learned before the mind did. This shaped communication. Descriptions were practical. Instructions were brief. There was little room for abstraction. Life was immediate. Dirt and smoke anchored people to the present. They reminded everyone that life happened here. Now, under these conditions, dreams were shaped by environment. Expectations were limited accordingly. This physical reality did not inspire despair. It inspired adaptation. People learned to function within it, to build routines that accounted for discomfort. Complaints changed nothing. Acceptance reduced effort. The environment became background, and yet its influence was constant. It shaped health, movement, work, and perception. It left marks on bodies that would never be recorded. It influenced life expectancy without explanation. The medieval world did not hide its harshness, it embedded it into daily life. And as people moved through mud, breathed smoke, and carried dirt with them, they also carried something else: quiet awareness of the body's limits, a familiarity with discomfort, and an understanding that illness and weakness were never far away. An understanding that would soon become unavoidable. As the body itself began to fail, in ways that could not be ignored, and ailments appeared without warning or name. Illness without names, doctors without answers. In the medieval world, sickness arrived quietly. There were no warnings, no explanations, and rarely any clear beginning. A person could wake with a headache that refused to leave, a cough that deepened with each day, or a weakness that settled into the limbs without reason. These changes were noticed, but not understood. Illness had no name. People described symptoms, not conditions. Pain was sharp or dull. Fever was heat or chills. Weakness was heaviness in the body. There were no diagnoses, only experiences shared in simple language. A person was not sick in a modern sense. They were not well, struck, weakened, or taken. These words reflected uncertainty rather than clarity. Illness was something that happened to you, not something you could define or predict. Doctors existed, but answers did not. Medical knowledge was built on tradition, observation, and ancient texts rather than experimentation. Much of what was believed had been inherited from Greek and Roman writers, filtered through centuries of copying and interpretation. The body was understood through balance. Health was thought to depend on the proper mixture of bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Illness was imbalance. Treatment aimed to restore harmony rather than address cause. This approach offered structure, not certainty. When someone fell ill, attention turned inward and upward rather than outward. People searched for meaning, not mechanism. Why now? Why this person? What had been disturbed? Answers were moral, spiritual, or environmental. Doctors asked questions about diet, mood, sleep, and recent events. Had the person eaten too much of one food? Experienced strong emotion? Been exposed to cold or damp? These factors mattered more than invisible agents. There was no concept of infection. Diseases were not understood as spreading entities. They were conditions arising within the body, influenced by surroundings and behavior. This meant illness was deeply personal, even when many fell sick at once. When epidemics occurred, confusion intensified. People recognized patterns, many becoming ill simultaneously, but lacked a framework to explain them. Causes were attributed to bad air, divine displeasure, or cosmic alignment. Fear filled the gap where knowledge should have been. Doctors relied on visible signs. The color of urine was examined closely. Pulse was felt and described. Skin was touched. Tongue inspected. These observations were systematic, but interpretation varied widely. Two doctors could see the same patient and offer different explanations. Treatments reflected this uncertainty. Bloodletting was common. Removing blood was believed to restore balance. Leeches were used. Veins were opened carefully, sometimes repeatedly. Weakness was interpreted as excess, not deficiency. Purging followed. Patients were given substances to induce vomiting or diarrhea. The goal was to expel harmful humors. Relief was sometimes temporary, reinforcing belief in the method. Herbal remedies filled the rest. Plants were collected, dried, and prepared into teas or poultices. Some offered genuine relief. Others did nothing. Few were harmful enough to be abandoned quickly. Trial and tradition. Guided choice. Pain was expected. Treatments were rarely gentle. Discomfort was seen as part of healing. If something hurt, it meant something was happening. Relief without suffering was suspicious. Patients endured without complaint. There were limits to medical help. Doctors were expensive and rare. Most people relied on local healers, midwives, or family knowledge. Care was communal rather than professional. Advice was shared freely. Women often held practical medical knowledge, passed down through experience. They knew which herbs soothed pain, which eased childbirth, which slowed bleeding. This knowledge existed outside formal texts. It was trusted quietly. Illness blurred the boundary between medicine and religion. Prayer accompanied treatment. Saints were invoked. Pilgrimages were made. Healing was hoped for rather than expected. Faith offered comfort when medicine could not. Some illnesses carried stigma. Conditions affecting the skin, mind, or behavior were feared. Visible difference invited suspicion. People worried about contagion, curse, or moral failing. Isolation followed uncertainty. Mental illness had no category. Changes in behavior were explained spiritually. Visions were signs. Confusion was possession. Depression was despair of the soul. There was little room for neutrality. Suffering required explanation. Children were especially vulnerable. High mortality was accepted without understanding. Infants weakened quickly. Fevers burned through small bodies. Parents learned not to ask why too loudly. Grief was frequent, but quiet. Illness shaped daily decisions. People watched one another closely. A cough was noticed. Pale skin prompted concern. Work slowed when bodies weakened. There was no separation between health and survival. A sick body meant lost labor. Communities adapted. Neighbors helped when possible. Food was shared. Tasks redistributed. But patience had limits. Long-term illness strained resources. Care depended on usefulness. Recovery was unpredictable. Some people improved suddenly, others faded slowly. There was no timeline. Prognosis was vague. Doctors avoided certainty, protecting reputation rather than truth. Hope remained cautious. The body was mysterious. Pain appeared without cause and disappeared without reason. This unpredictability reinforced humility. The body could not be controlled fully. Acceptance replaced expectation. People learned to live alongside illness. Chronic pain became part of identity. Limping, coughing, weaknesses were accommodated rather than treated. Work was adjusted. Roles changed quietly. Life continued. The language of illness reflected this reality. Words described sensation, not diagnosis. People spoke of heaviness, burning, sharpness, cold. These descriptions were precise in experience, but vague in meaning. Understanding stopped at the body's edge. Illness was not private. Symptoms were visible. Smell, sound, movemental, signaled health. There was little separation between personal suffering and public awareness. Privacy was rare. This shaped emotional response. Fear was present, but not dramatic. Illness was expected eventually. Surprise lay not in becoming sick, but in surviving. Longevity was uncertain. Doctors themselves were limited. They studied texts more than bodies. Dissection was rare or forbidden. Knowledge advanced slowly, cautiously, and often incorrectly. Confidence exceeded accuracy. Mistakes were common and unrecorded. There was no system to correct errors. Treatments continued because they were traditional, not because they worked. Failure was attributed to fate. The absence of clear answers created space for imagination. Stories filled the gaps. Illness became narrative punishment, test, warning, or transformation. Meaning mattered more than mechanism. People searched for patterns, even when none existed. This worldview shaped resilience. Without expectation of cure, people focused on endurance. Pain was managed, not eliminated. Life was adjusted, not paused. The goal was continuation. Illness revealed inequality. The wealthy could rest. The poor worked through pain. Recovery depended on position as much as treatment. Health was not evenly distributed. This reality was accepted quietly. Complaints changed nothing. Adaptation mattered more than protest. The medieval body existed in negotiation with illness. It was never fully healthy, never fully sick. Strength fluctuated, weakness came and went. Life adjusted accordingly. There was no ideal state. This constant proximity to illness shaped how people understood death. Death was not sudden or shocking. It often followed visible decline. Bodies signaled their limits before stopping. Death was familiar. Illness prepared people for it. Symptoms softened the boundary. The body slowly withdrew. Communities adjusted. Ritual followed naturally. Fear was present, but surprise was rare. And yet, not all illness was slow. Some arrived suddenly, violently, and without warning. Entire villages weakened at once. Symptoms spread faster than understanding. These moments unsettled even the most accepting minds. They suggested something larger than imbalance, something beyond individual bodies, something that moved unseen from person to person. A threat that could not be explained by humors or prayer alone. And when such sickness appeared, when patterns grew too large to ignore, people began to sense that illness was not only personal, it could be collective. A realization that would soon challenge everything they believed about health, fate, and survival. The strange comfort of routine in a harsh world. In a world where comfort was rare, routine became its replacement. Medieval life offered few guarantees. Food could disappear. Illness could arrive without warning. Weather could undo months of labor in a single day. And yet, people did not live in constant panic. What steadied them was not security, but repetition. Days followed familiar patterns. Morning came with light, rather than alarm. Work began when the body was ready, not when a clock demanded it. Tasks repeated themselves so often that they required little thought. Hands moved from memory. Feet followed paths worn smooth by years of use. Routine reduced uncertainty. When so much lay beyond control, knowing what came next mattered deeply. Even harsh tasks felt manageable when expected. The rhythm of the day became a quiet reassurance. This is what happens now. And then this familiar labor soft fear. Fields were worked in the same order each season. Tools were picked up the same way. Movements repeated thousands of times. There was comfort in knowing the body could perform without instruction. The mind rested within habit. Meals followed routine as well. Food was simple but predictable. Bread in the morning, Pottage. At night, special days marked by small changes. Knowing what would be eaten mattered more than abundance. Expectation mattered more than variety. Even hunger became routine. Periods of scarcity were remembered and anticipated. People adjusted portions gradually. The body learned restraint. Hunger did not surprise. It returned on schedule. This predictability reduced anxiety. Work and rest followed. Familiar cycles. Certain days carried meaning. Market days. Holy days. Seasonal pauses. These moments broke monotony gently. Without disruption, change was controlled and rare. Religious routine anchored time. Prayers marked hours. Church bells organized days when they existed. Rituals provided structure when understanding failed. Even those who questioned doctrine relied on rhythm. Faith was partly habit. The repetition of words mattered as much as belief. Familiar phrases soothed the mind. The act of praying created order in a world that offered little explanation. Routine gave suffering a frame. Illness, when it appeared, was folded into daily rhythm. Care followed known steps. Herbs prepared. Prayers spoken. Waiting endured. There was no frantic search for novelty. Repetition replaced panic. Routines mattered deeply. Villages moved together. People woke, worked, and rested in loose synchronization. This shared rhythm reduced isolation. Individual hardship felt less overwhelming when mirrored by others. Suffering was shared quietly. Sound reinforced routine. The same noises returned daily: the crackle of fire, the thud of tools, the low murmur of conversation. These sounds signaled continuity. Silence, when broken, was noticed. Familiar noise meant normalcy. Even unpleasant sounds reassured. Coughing, animals, creaking wood, these indicated life continuing. Sudden quiet felt more dangerous than constant discomfort. Stillness signaled absence. Children absorbed routine early. They learned when to help, when to stay quiet, when to move aside. Instruction was minimal. Observation taught everything. Repetition formed memory. Routine replaced explanation. Through routine, knowledge survived. Skills were passed down through demonstration, not theory. The body learned first. Words came later, if at all. This made tradition resilient. Change threatened stability. New methods were met cautiously. Novelty introduced risk. Even improvement was suspicious if it disrupted rhythm. Consistency mattered more than efficiency. Routine also softened loss. Death was frequent, but the steps following death were known. Washing, prayer, burial. The predictability of mourning helped people endure it. Grief followed a pattern. This did not lessen pain, but it gave its structure. When emotion overwhelmed, ritual carried people forward. Action replaced paralysis. In a harsh world, routine became emotional armor. It allowed people to function despite fear, to work despite pain, to continue despite uncertainty. Routine did not promise happiness. It promised survivability. This comfort was subtle. People rarely articulated it. They did not speak of routine as safety. They simply felt its absence when disrupted. Chaos was felt immediately. Famine broke routine. When food disappeared, daily patterns collapsed. Meals shifted or vanished. Work slowed or stopped. Anxiety increased sharply. The loss of rhythm caused as much distress as hunger itself. Routine mattered as much as calories. War shattered routine even more violently. Marching armies disrupted harvests. Travel routes closed. Familiar sounds were replaced by foreign ones. People fled not only danger, but disruption. Loss of routine felt like loss of identity. Plague did the same. When illness spread widely, routines failed. Work stopped. Rituals changed. Silence replaced familiar noise. This absence unsettled deeply. The world felt wrong. In contrast, stable routines made hardship tolerable. A cold winter was endured if daily tasks remained predictable. Illness was managed if care followed familiar steps. Predictability softened suffering. Routine also created meaning. Without long-term plans or distant goals, people found purpose in repetition. Completing tasks mattered because they were expected. Expectation created worth. A day completed according to pattern felt successful, even if nothing improved. This mindset shaped worldview. Life was not about progress, it was about continuity. Improvement was rare and often accidental. Survival was achievement enough. Routine validated existence. Even joy appeared through routine. Festivals followed calendars. Celebrations returned yearly. Anticipation grew slowly. Joy was not spontaneous, it was scheduled. This made it reliable. People looked forward to known pleasures rather than hoping for unknown ones. Routine protected against disappointment. Routine also limited imagination. Alternative lives were difficult to envision. Change felt threatening. The known, even when harsh, felt safer than the unknown. This reinforced social stability. Hierarchy persisted because routine normalized it. Roles repeated. Expectations remained fixed. Routine maintained order. Yet within routine, subtle variation existed. Weather changed tasks. Health altered pace. Mood shifted effort. Life was not mechanical. Routine was flexible, not rigid. It allowed adaptation without collapse. This balance made medieval life resilient. People bent without breaking. They adjusted without reimagining everything. Routine absorbed shock. Over time, this created emotional endurance. People expected hardship, but trusted routine to carry them through it. Fear existed, but did not dominate. The future was uncertain, but tomorrow looked familiar. This familiarity calmed the mind. Routine became a form of quiet hope, not hope for improvement, but hope for continuation. The belief that the day would unfold as expected, even if painfully. Consistency mattered more than comfort. This worldview shaped how people responded to crises. They did not panic immediately. They waited to see if routine would return. Only when disruption persisted did fear deepen. Routine was the first defense. But routine had limits. When disruption became permanent, when familiar rhythms failed repeatedly, something shifted. People began to notice change not as anomaly, but as new normal. And when routine itself could no longer be trusted, when days no longer followed pattern, when work stopped without resuming, when illness or absence altered everything, people were forced to confront a deeper realization. That routine, while comforting, was fragile, and that beneath its steady surface, there were forces capable of unraveling it completely. Forces that did not announce themselves, did not follow calendars, and did not respect habit. Forces that would soon reshape daily life in ways routine could no longer soften. Why news traveled slowly and often changed along the way in the medieval world. News did not arrive. It drifted. There were no headlines, no schedules, and no certainty that information would reach anyone at all. What people knew about the wider world arrived slowly, unevenly, and often long after events had already passed. Distance muted urgency. Messages moved at the speed of feet, hooves, or wind. A rider could carry news, but only as far as the road allowed. Roads themselves were unreliable, washed out by rain, blocked by snow, or avoided due to danger. Travel was conditional. News depended on people who happened to be moving: merchants, pilgrims, messengers, soldiers. These were the carriers of information, though that was rarely their main purpose. News traveled because people traveled. If no one came, nothing was known. Most people lived their lives with very limited awareness of the world beyond nearby villages. Events occurring a few days away might as well have been happening on another continent. Relevance was measured by proximity. When news did arrive, it was already old. A battle might be over. A king might be dead. A famine might have begun weeks earlier. People learned about events not as unfolding stories, but as completed outcomes that there was no sense of immediacy. This delay shaped emotional response. Shock was muted. Fear was diluted by time. By the time people heard about disaster, it had either resolved or become distant memory. Urgency rarely survived travel. Accuracy was another casualty. Every retelling altered the message slightly. Details were forgotten, misunderstood, or reshaped to fit the listener's expectations. News was not recorded, it was remembered. Memory replaced documentation. People filled gaps instinctively. When facts were missing, assumptions stepped in. Motives were imagined. Causes were guessed. These additions felt natural and convincing. Stories evolved without intention. Language itself contributed to change. Different regions used different words. Meanings shifted. A phrase spoken casually could sound ominous elsewhere. Tone did not survive distance. Meaning fractured easily. Authority mattered. News carried by someone important and official. A priest, a noble was trusted more readily. But authority did not guarantee accuracy. It only guaranteed confidence. Confidence often replaced truth. Rumor thrived in this environment. Unverified stories spread because they explained uncertainty. Fearful ideas traveled faster than careful ones. A frightening rumor required less proof than a boring truth. Emotion accelerated information. People remembered what frightened them. Stories involving danger, betrayal, or divine punishment were repeated enthusiastically. Mundane details were dropped. Over time, events became simplified into moral lessons. Complexity disappeared. This process shaped collective memory. Events were remembered not as they happened, but as they were told over generations. Stories hardened into legend. Fact and interpretation merged. Local experience mattered more than distant truth. If something did not affect daily life, it was quickly forgotten. News without consequence faded. Information survived only if it altered behavior. Relevance determined survival. This filtered worldview. People believed what aligned with their experience. Distant claims were judged against local reality. If something contradicted what people saw daily, it was doubted or ignored. Skepticism existed quietly. Written news was rare. Most people could not read. Written documents existed, but they moved even more slowly than people. Letters required delivery, literacy, and trust. Oral transmission dominated. Even written messages were read aloud, interpreted by the reader's tone and bias. Meaning depended on the messenger as much as the message. Words were never neutral. News also traveled unevenly across class. The wealthy heard more. They had access to messengers, letters, and travelers. The poor relied on chance encounters. Knowledge reflected position. This inequality shaped response. Those with early information could prepare. Others reacted after impact. Timing became advantage. Ignorance was not a choice. Markets and churches acted as information hubs. People gathered. News was exchanged casually. Fragments were shared. Details compared. Consensus emerged slowly. Truth was negotiated socially. Contradictions were common. Different versions of the same event circulated simultaneously. People chose which to believe based on trust rather than evidence. Belief was relational. Silence was also informative. The absence of news suggested normalcy. If nothing was said, people assumed nothing had changed. This reinforced routine and stability. Silence meant safety. But silence could also hide danger. Without warning systems, disasters arrived unannounced. Floods, raids, disease often struck without prior knowledge. Surprise was common. This unpredictability increased reliance on routine. Without reliable information, people trusted familiar patterns. News disrupted routine only when it could no longer be ignored. Change was recognized late. The slowness of news also. Soft conflict. Enemies felt distant until they arrived physically. Fear remained abstract until confirmed by sight or sound. Distance delayed panic, but once news arrived physically, through refugees, soldiers, or smoke, it was undeniable. Reality replaced rumor instantly. In times of crisis, news accelerated. People moved quickly when survival demanded it. Information passed through action rather than words. Movement became message plague. Rumors spread through observation. Sick travelers, abandoned villages, sudden deaths. These were seen before explained. Visual evidence traveled faster than words. Fear learned to read signs. In such moments, routine collapsed. People paid attention differently. Silence felt threatening. Absence became alarming. The world felt unstable. News, once slow and distant, became immediate and personal. But by then, it was often too late. This cycle shaped medieval awareness. People lived in partial knowledge, reacting slowly, adapting late, and trusting what felt familiar. Ignorance was not failure, it was structural. This made the medieval world emotionally quieter, but also more vulnerable. Existed because threat was often unseen. Panic erupted only when reality became unavoidable. Routine filled the space where information was missing. People lived inside what they knew, not what existed. And when news finally arrived that could not be soft, delayed, or reinterpreted when events reached the village, not as stories, but as consequences. Routine itself began to strain. The familiar rhythm faltered. And in that pause, fear found room to grow, not loudly, but quietly, settling into ordinary days, hiding behind habits, waiting for the moment when even routine could no longer pretend that nothing had changed. Work that never ended, yet was rarely written about. Medieval life was built on work that left almost no trace. Not because it was unimportant, but because it was ordinary. The kind of work that happened every day, in every season, across countless lives, so constant that it felt invisible. Chroniclers rarely wrote about it. Records passed over it. Yet it was this work that held everything together. Most people worked from waking until sleep. There was no clear boundary between labor and life. Work did not begin with a signal or end with a bell. It flowed naturally into the day, shaped by light, weather, and bodily endurance. If there was light, there was work. Fields demanded constant attention. Soil had to be turned, seeds planted, weeds removed, animals tended, fences repaired. Even when nothing dramatic happened, effort continued. Maintenance mattered as much as harvest. Neglect showed quickly. A single missed task could compound into larger problems. Weeds spread, animals weakened. Tools broke. Work prevented collapse rather than created progress. This made labor feel endless. Much of this work was repetitive. The same motions performed daily, weekly, seasonally. Hands learned patterns so deeply that thought was unnecessary. Muscle memory replaced instruction. Repetition became survival. Women's labor was especially constant. Cooking, cleaning, caring, repairing, these tasks repeated without pause. Meals had to be prepared daily, often from scratch. Clothing required mending. Children needed supervision. Water had to be fetched. Fires tended. There were no days off. This work was rarely recorded. It did not produce monuments, victories, or wealth. It produced continuity, and continuity was assumed, not celebrated. Silence surrounded it. Children worked as soon as they could help. Small hands carried water, watched animals, gathered fuel. Learning happened through participation, not schooling. Childhood blended into labor gradually, without ceremony. Work taught responsibility early. Men's labor was physically demanding, but equally repetitive. Plowing, harvesting, building, repairing, these tasks strained the body steadily rather than dramatically. Injuries accumulated slowly. Strength declined quietly. Pain was endured, not discussed. Craftsmen worked long hours. Shoemakers, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters each relied on skill refined through endless repetition. Tools were simple. Output was slow. Quality mattered because replacement was costly. Mistakes lingered. Even skilled labor offered little rest. Demand was constant. Income was uncertain. Work continued as long as the body allowed. Work. Work defined identity. People were known by what they did. Names often reflected occupations. To stop working was to lose purpose and position. Inactivity was feared. Illness disrupted work more than it caused pain. Sick body meant unfinished tasks. Fields unattended. Tools unused. Others had to compensate. Work tied individuals to community. Neighbors helped when possible, but help was limited. Everyone had their own labor to manage. Long-term incapacity strained goodwill. Survival depended on contribution. Work was seasonal, but never absent. Winter changed tasks rather than eliminated them. Tools were repaired. Animals fed. Fuel gathered. Clothing mended. Food rationed carefully. Stillness was rare. Night offered the only true pause. Even then, rest was incomplete. Bodies ached. Sleep was light. Worry lingered. Tomorrow's work weighted that fatigue accumulated quietly. This constant labor shaped time perception. Days blended together. Memory organized itself around seasons rather than dates. Life was measured in harvests, not years. Monotony altered awareness. Because work was constant, it was rarely remarked upon. People spoke about unusual event storms, deaths, visitors. Work was background noise. It did not feel like a story worth telling. Normality erased itself. Written records reflect this bias. Kings, wars, laws, and disasters dominate texts. The labor that fed armies and sustained kingdoms appears only indirectly. Work supported history without entering it. This absence shapes modern misunderstanding. Without records, it is easy to underestimate the sheer volume of effort required to maintain medieval life. Survival demanded more energy than modern life. Imagine's ease was rare. Tools were limited. Simple implements required strength and time. Efficiency was low by modern standards. A task that now takes minutes once consumed hours. Time was spent, not saved. There was no expectation of improvement. Work did not promise advancement. Effort maintained status rather than elevated it. Ambition was constrained by structure. Endurance mattered more than aspiration. This created a specific kind of resilience. People learned to accept effort without reward. Satisfaction came from completion rather than achievement. Work ended tasks, not problems. Communal labor offered brief relief. Harvests brought shared effort. Large tasks required many hands. These moments created temporary solidarity. Shared fatigue bonded people. Yet even communal work did not shorten days. It intensified them. Long hours were normalized during critical periods. Exhaustion was expected. Recovery followed necessity, not desire. Work shaped bodies visibly. Calloused hands, bent backs, worn joints. These signs marked adulthood. Youth was brief. Physical decline began early. Aging was accelerated. This physical reality influenced respect. Those who could still work were valued. Those who could not were vulnerable. Worth followed usefulness. Work also shaped morality. Hard work was praised. Idleness condemned. Moral judgment aligned with productivity. Work became virtue. This worldview justified inequality. Those who suffered were assumed to have failed in effort or fortune. Structural limits were invisible. Blame filled gaps in understanding. Even leisure was rare and conditional. Festivals allowed rest briefly, but often involved preparation and cleanup. True leisure was uncommon. Rest required justification. Despite this, people adapted psychologically. They found rhythm in labor. Familiar motions provided mental calm. Work filled time that might otherwise be spent worrying. Labor distracted from fear. This echoes through generations. Work patterns passed down unchanged. Innovation. threaten rhythm. Stability mattered more than efficiency. Tradition preserved effort. This is why so little was written. Work felt eternal. It did not begin with one generation or end with another. Writing about it felt unnecessary. It simply existed. And yet, this work supported everything else. Without it, no castles stood, no armies marched, no markets functioned, no rituals continued. Work was the foundation beneath history. Its absence from records does not mean absence from life. It means it was too constant to. Notice that too familiar to describe, too essential to question. But when work was interrupted by illness, by war, by hunger, by fear, its importance became suddenly visible. Silence replaced motion. Tasks went undone. Routine fractured. And in that absence, people realized something unsettling, that their world did not rest on kings or events, but on the quiet, unending labor of ordinary bodies. Bodies that could weaken, bodies that could fail. And when they did, the fragile balance of daily life began to shift slowly at first, almost imperceptibly toward a strain that no amount of routine or effort could fully absorb. Children growing into adulthood without childhood in the medieval world. Childhood was brief not because it was denied, but because it was unnecessary. Children were not rushed deliberately. There was no formal moment when childhood ended. It simply dissolved into responsibility, one task at a time. As soon as a child could walk steadily, carry something light, or understand instruction, they became useful, and usefulness mattered. Play existed, but it was secondary. Children played when work allowed it, not instead of it. Games emerged from daily life: stones, sticks, scraps of fabric. Play blended easily into labor and back again, without clear separation. There was no protected phase of innocence. Adults did not view children as fragile minds, needing shelter. They were smaller bodies, learning how to survive. Exposure to hardship was not seen as harmful, it was educational. Children learned by watching. They observed adults closely, absorbing routines without explanation. There were few lessons given formally. Correction happened through demonstration or consequence. Mistakes taught quickly. A spilled bucket meant extra work. A wandering animal meant trouble. Responsibility arrived quietly, reinforced by necessity rather than discipline. Children were expected to adapt. By the age modern societies call early, medieval children were already contributing, fetching water, gathering firewood, watching younger siblings, carrying messages. These tasks were not framed as burdens. They were simply part of life. Childhood had no separate schedule. There were no school hours for most, no age-based milestones. Time was measured by capability, not years. A child was old enough when they could do the work. This varied widely. Some children matured physically faster. Others lagged. Expectations adjusted accordingly. There was little comparison across households. Development was practical, not standardized. Emotional maturity followed responsibility. Children learned early that fear, pain, and loss were part of existence. Death was visible. Illness was common. Absence was frequent. There was little shielding. This did not mean children were unloved. Parents cared deeply. They protected when possible. But protection did not mean isolation from reality. Love existed within limits. High child mortality shaped attachment. Parents bonded, but cautiously. Loss was common enough to encourage emotional restraint. Grief was real, but expectations softened shock. This shaped family dynamics. Children learned not to expect permanence. Siblings disappeared. Parents weakened. Households changed. Stability was fragile. Adaptability became survival skill. Education was experiential. Children learned trades by doing, skills passed down through repetition. There were no manuals. Knowledge lived in hands, not books. Memory replaced instruction. Girls learned domestic labor early. Cooking, cleaning, textile work, childcare, these skills were taught through participation. By adolescence, many girls were fully capable household managers. Womanhood arrived quietly. Boys learned fieldwork or trades. They worked alongside fathers, uncles, masters. Strength developed early. Injury risk followed. Manhood arrived through endurance. Puberty did not mark adulthood. Capability. Marriage came early. By modern standards, teenagers often entered adult roles quickly. Marriage meant new responsibilities rather than romance. Family was economic unit first. Children became adults without ceremony. There was no graduation, no celebration of independence. One day, tasks increased, expectations shifted. Childhood ended unnoticed. Memory blurred the transition. This lack of separation shaped identity. People did not reflect on childhood as a distinct phase. Memory organized itself around events, not ages. Life felt continuous. Emotional expression was shaped by this reality. Children learned restraint early. Crying changed little. Complaints were discouraged by circumstance rather than rule. Stoicism developed naturally. This did not erase joy. Children laughed, teased, imagined, but joy existed alongside responsibility, not apart from it. Pleasure was momentary. Stories filled some gaps. Legends, religious stories, these offered imagination and meaning. Children listened while working or resting. Stories taught caution more than fantasy. Fairy tales warned more than they entertained. Danger was central. These stories mirrored reality. Children learned that forests were dangerous, strangers unpredictable, hunger persistent. Stories reinforced survival logic. Imagination served instruction. Social hierarchy was learned early. Children observed authority lords, priests, masters. Obedience was modeled, not debated. Questioning was rare. This reinforced stability. Children accepted their place because alternatives were invisible. Change required imagination, which was limited by experience. This shaped ambition. Most children expected to live lives similar to their parents. Variation was rare and often unwelcome. Aspiration was bounded. This did not eliminate hope. Hope existed in small forms, good harvests, healthy children, mild winters. Dreams were practical. Loss shaped children deeply. Witnessing death early normalized it. Mourning rituals included children. There was no exclusion. Death was familiar. This familiarity altered fear. Children feared suffering more than death itself. Pain was tangible. Death was inevitable. Acceptance formed early. Work accelerated maturity. Children learned cause and effect quickly. Effort mattered. Neglect showed consequences. Responsibility sharpened awareness. This created competence. By adolescence, many children possessed skills modern adults lack. They managed households, animals, tools. Competence replaced innocence. Yet vulnerability remained. Children were physically smaller, weaker, more susceptible to illness. Work injured them. Fatigue accumulated. Resilience had limits. Exploitation existed. Not all labor was family-based. Some children were sent to work elsewhere. Apprenticeships could be harsh. Servitude blurred into abuse. Protection was inconsistent. Orphan children were especially vulnerable. Without family, survival depended on charity or labor. Childhood ended immediately. Mercy was unreliable. Despite this, children adapted. They learned quickly who to trust, where to stand, when to speak. Social intelligence developed early. This adaptability shaped adulthood. Adults carried childhood lessons forward: caution, endurance, acceptance. Emotional expression remained restrained. This continuity blurred generational. Parents and children shared similar realities. The gap between them felt smaller than in later societies. Experience aligned them. There was little nostalgia for childhood. Few adults romanticized it. Childhood was remembered as incomplete adulthood rather than a golden age. Memory focused forward. This worldview influenced how societies valued youth. Children were not idealized. They were prepared. Preparation mattered more than preservation. Yet the system was fragile. It relied on stability, routine, predictable roles. When disruption, famine, diseased children suffered first. Responsibility increased faster than capacity during crisis. Childhood vanished completely. Children became laborers, caretakers, survivors. In such moments, the absence of childhood became stark. But it was not questioned. There was no language for it, only necessity. This pattern repeated across generations. Children grew into adults without pause, and adults aged quickly under constant effort. Life accelerated. Time felt shorter. The absence of childhood as a protected space shaped medieval society deeply. It created resilience, but limited reflection. It produced capable adults, but little room for emotional processing. Suffering was endured, not examined. And when those children became parents themselves, they passed on not trauma, but expectation. The expectation that life required early strength, that responsibility was not optional, and that survival depended on learning quickly. But this system, resilient as it was, depended on something delicate: continuity. And when continuity fractured, when work stopped, when routine collapsed, when families were faced realities even harsher than responsibility, they faced absence, loss, without structure, and a world where even early maturity could not prepare them for what came next. Faith as a daily habit, not a dramatic choice in the medieval world. Faith was not something people decided. It was something they lived inside. Belief did not arrive through revelation or crises for most people. It surrounded them from birth, woven into daily routine so completely that it rarely felt optional. Faith did not demand constant attention. It shaped the background of life. Religion was ordinary. Prayers marked the day the way meals did. Certain words were spoken at waking and before sleep. Blessings accompanied work. Invocations soft uncertainty. These acts required little reflection. Faith followed habit. Church was not a place of transformation. It was a place of rhythm. Attendance structured weeks. Bells organized time. Ritual created continuity. When life felt unstable, people went because it was expected, not because they questioned belief. Belief was assumed, doubt existed, but quietly. There was little space to explore alternatives. Different beliefs were rarely visible. Questioning doctrine required education, leisure, and safety luxuries most did not have. Faith was inherited, not chosen. Religious language filled everyday speech. People invoked God casually, not dramatically. Gratitude, frustration, fear all expressed through familiar phrases. These words shaped emotion. Faith provided explanation. When knowledge failed, illness, weather, birth, death when causes were unclear, divine will offered coherence. This did not eliminate suffering, but it gave it meaning. Meaning mattered more than accuracy. Ritual offered comfort through repetition, candles lit, knees bent, words spoken aloud. These actions stabilized the mind. Even when belief wavered, ritual remained. Action replaced certainty. People did not need to feel faith to practice it. Habit sustained belief when emotion faded. Religion structured morality. Good behavior aligned with religious expectation. Right and wrong were framed through spiritual consequence. Fear of punishment blended with desire for approval. Morality felt external. This reduced internal conflict. Decisions followed known rules. Ambiguity was limited. Life felt simpler in moral terms. Even when difficult in practice, faith reduced cognitive burden. It answered questions before they were asked. Children absorbed faith without instruction. They learned prayers by imitation. Stories explained the world. Saints modeled behavior. Faith, education was experiential. Fear and hope were balanced. Religion warned of punishment, but promised protection. Hell existed, but so did forgiveness. Suffering was framed as test rather than failure. This duality stabilized emotion. Faith also created community. Shared belief unified villages. Rituals gathered people regularly. Collective prayer reinforced social bonds. Isolation was rare. Festivals punctuated the year. Holy days allowed rest, celebration, and relief. These moments broke monotony without threatening order. Joy was permitted on schedule. Faith gave time shape. The calendar mattered. Seasons aligned with religious observance. Time felt purposeful. Life followed a sacred rhythm. This rhythm normalized inequality. Hierarchy was presented as divinely ordered. Roles felt fixed. Acceptance was encouraged. Faith reinforced structure. This was not always comforting. People suffering unjustly were told their reward lay elsewhere. This offered solace, but discouraged challenge. Faith soft frustration. Miracles existed at the edges. Most people did not expect them. They hoped quietly. Faith did not promise change, only endurance. Expectation remained limited. Clergy were mediators, not authorities on truth. Priests interpreted doctrine, but their influence varied. Some were respected, others were ignored. Faith was personal and local. Corruption existed. Not all clergy embodied belief. This created quiet cynicism. People noticed hypocrisy, but continued practice. Habit outweighed trust. Faith also regulated fear. Evil was explained through demons, curses, or sin. Naming fear made it manageable. Unknown threats became knowable. This reduced anxiety. Faith-shaped response to death, dying followed ritual. Last rites mattered. Preparation offered comfort. Death was not chaotic. Grief followed structure. Mourning rituals guided emotion. People knew what to do when words failed. Faith held grief together. Prayer replaced conversation. People spoke to God about things they could not say aloud. This created emotional outlet. Faith was not intellectual. Most people did not debate theology. They practiced. Belief was embodied. This reduced conflict. Questions that troubled modern minds were irrelevant. Life required action, not contemplation. Faith allowed focus. Even non-belief was framed religiously. Skepticism was expressed as moral weakness, not philosophical position. Alternative frameworks were invisible. Faith permeated everything. It touched work, family, health, death. It required no dramatic choice because it was never absent. Religion was air, not fire. People breathed it without noticing. This constancy shaped resilience. When suffering came, people did not ask, "Why me?" They asked, "What now?" Faith guided response. It encouraged patience. Patience was virtue. Endurance was rewarded spiritually. This made suffering bearable. But this framework had limits. Faith could explain much, but not everything. When disasters grew too large, too frequent, too indiscriminate, explanation strained. Some suffering resisted. Meaning, in those moments, ritual felt empty. Words repeated without comfort. People continued practices even when faith faltered. Habit carried them forward. But beneath the surface, questions stirred. Not voiced openly, not organized, but felt. When prayer did not protect. When illness ignored devotion. When children died despite faith. These moments did not destroy belief. They complicated it. People adjusted quietly. Faith remained, but trust wavered. This tension accumulated. And when events began to overwhelm explanation, when suffering became collective rather than personal, when ritual could no longer contain fear, people faced the reality. Their daily faith was never meant to answer fully. A reality where habit alone could not restore balance. Where belief, practiced daily, met circumstances too vast for quiet acceptance. And in that space, something began to shift, not belief itself, but the way people related to it. A shift that would soon reshape routine, challenge endurance, and force faith to confront a world that no longer behaved as expected. The quiet presence of death in ordinary homes, death in the medieval world, did not arrive with drama. It did not burst through doors or announce itself with urgency. It entered quietly, often without warning, and stayed long enough to be accepted. In ordinary homestead-roofed cottages, shared halls, single-room dwellings, it was not an intruder, but a familiar presence, as constant as smoke in the rafters or mud at the threshold. Most people did not die in distant places. They died where they had lived. Beside the hearth, on straw-filled beds, on wooden benches pulled close to the fire. There were no hospitals in the modern sense, no sterile rooms, no machines humming in the background. Illness unfolded slowly, witnessed by everyone in the household. Children watched parents weaken. Spouses listened to breathing change through the night. Death was not hidden from view. It was part of the domestic space. When sickness began, it rarely came with certainty. A cough lingered. A fever returned again and again. A wound refused to heal. People spoke softly about it, not because they were afraid of death itself, but because there was little to say. Naming the danger did not make it leave. There were no diagnoses, no clear explanations, only signs that the body was no longer keeping pace with the work demanded of it. Homes adjusted quietly. Work slowed. A neighbor might take over a task in the fields. A child might fetch water more often. Life bent around the failing body, not stopping, but accommodating. Death was approached indirectly, through small acts of care rather than words. As the end drew closer, there was no sudden shift into panic. The dying person was kept warm. Water was offered, even when it could no longer be swallowed. Prayers were murmured, not dramatically, but as Habaphrases learned early and repeated often. Faith did not erase fear, but it gave shape to waiting. It told people what to do with their hands, their voices, their thoughts. The moment of death itself was often quiet enough to be missed. A breath taken and then not returned. A pause that stretched slightly longer than the others. Someone noticed. Someone else confirmed it. There was no rush. The body remained where it was, surrounded by the familiar tools on the wall. The smell of smoke, the worn floor beneath. Death did not transform the space. It simply settled into it. Afterward, the living stayed close. Bodies were not immediately removed. There was time to sit, to touch a hand that was already cooling, to adjust clothing, to close eyes. These acts were not ceremonial. They were practical and intimate. The dead were prepared by people who had known every ordinary detail of their lives. No stranger performed this task. Children were present. They were not sent away. They learned early that death was not separate from life, but its conclusion. Fear came later, shaped by memory. In the moment, there was curiosity, confusion, and acceptance. The body looked familiar, yet differenced till, quiet, finally free from hunger and fatigue. Grief was expressed carefully. Loud displays were uncommon, not because pain was absent, but because life around it continued. Animals still needed feeding. Fires still needed tending. The living could not afford to collapse completely. Sorrow was woven into movement, into work done with heavier hands and slower steps. Night after death felt different. The house seemed fuller, even though someone was gone. Shadows stretched longer. Sounds carried more weight. People slept lightly, aware of the absence as much as the presence that had just passed through their lives. Burial followed soon, guided by custom rather than choice. The dead were not kept long. Earth waited, as it always had. The process was simple. There were no elaborate markers, foremost no carved stone, no written names. Memory was carried by those who remained fragile and temporary. Yet death did not end relationships. The dead continued to exist in conversation, in habit, in the way a tool was used or a task remembered. People spoke of them without reverence or distance. They were still part of the household story, just no longer physically present. What is most striking, from a modern distance, is not the frequency of death, but the lack of spectacle around it. Medieval people did not dramatize what they could not avoid. Death was not romanticized, nor was it deeply feared in the way uncertainty often is today. It was understood as inevitable, unpredictable, and deeply personal. Ordinary homes bore witness to countless endings, yet they did not become places of despair. Life continued within the same walls where death had occurred. Children grew, meals were cooked, work resumed. The space did not demand forgetting, but it did not allow endless mourning either. In this way, death shaped medieval life, not through terror, but through familiarity. It reminded people of limits of time, strength, and control. It softened ambitions and sharpened routines. It made small moments matter, even if no one spoke that truth aloud. And yet, even in its familiarity, death was never fully understood. It remained quiet, final, and deeply human, a presence that entered ordinary homes without ceremony and left behind a silence that lingered just long enough to be noticed before life, inevitably, moved forward again. Why most medieval lives left no trace behind. Most medieval lives did not fade from history because they lacked importance. They vanished because the world they belonged to was never built to remember them. Memory, in that time, was not stored in ink or stone for ordinary people. It lived in voices, habits, gestures, and routines. Phragia, things that disappeared the moment those who carried them were gone. For the vast majority of medieval people, life unfolded without witnesses beyond their immediates. No chronicler stood beside the plowman. No scribe followed the washerwoman home. Their days were not shaped by events worth recording, at least not by the standards of those who controlled parchment and pen. What they did was necessary, repetitive, and expected. And because it was expected, it was invisible. Writing itself was a boundary. To write required training, materials, and lesser resources concentrated almost entirely among clergy, nobles, and administrators. Parchment was expensive. Ink had to be prepared. Time had to be set aside. For people whose lives were measured by daylight and survival, writing was not merely difficult. It was irrelevant. Their world did not ask them to leave records. It asked them to endure. Names, when spoken, were often practical rather than personal. A man was known as the cooper, the shepherd, the reeve. A woman was the baker's wife, the widow, the midwife. These names described function, not identity. They shifted as circumstances changed. When a role ended, the name attached to it dissolved. There was no expectation that a name should last longer than the usefulness it described. Even within families, memory was selective. Parents remembered children who survived. Children remembered parents who shaped their working lives. Those who died young worked quietly, or left no descendants, were absorbed into silence. Loss was so common that remembrance had limits. To remember everyone was impossible. Forgetting became a form of emotional survival. The work that filled medieval lives left little behind because it was designed to disappear. Fields were plowed, harvested, and plowed again. Fences rotted and were rebuilt. Homes were repaired, expanded, or abandoned. Tools were reused until they broke, then reshaped into something else. Nothing was meant to last untouched. Permanence was rare and unnecessary. Official records, when they mentioned ordinary people at all, did so briefly and without care. Tax lists counted households, not stories. Court records noted crimes, debts, and disputes, reducing lives to moments of conflict. Church registers marked births, marriages, and deaths with dates and names, but no details of character, struggle, or joy. A person appeared on parchment only at the edges of their existence. Poverty accelerated erasure. Those with little owned little that could survive them. Clothing was worn thin and repurposed. Furniture was simple and easily broken. Houses were built from materials that returned quickly to the earth. When someone died, their possessions were absorbed back into the household or the community. Nothing remained to mark that they had ever owned anything at all. Disaster erased memory on a larger scale. Fires swept through towns, consuming not only homes, but the few records that existed. Floods washed away boundaries and landmarks. Famine emptied villages so completely that no one remained to tell who had lived there. Plague moved faster than memory, leaving silence where entire communities once stood. Burial offered little resistance to forgetting. Most graves were shallow and unmarked. Wooden markers decayed within years. Stone was reserved for the wealthy, the powerful, or the spiritually significant. The earth closed over bodies quickly, reclaiming them without distinction. After a generation, even families could no longer point to where their dead lay. Time itself was relentless. Each generation faced its own demands, its own shortages, illnesses, obligations. There was little room to preserve detailed stories of the past when the present required constant attention. Memory shortened. Stories simplified. Eventually, even simplified stories vanished. Yet absence from record does not mean absence from impact. These forgotten lives shaped the medieval world more profoundly than any king or battle. They cleared forests, built roads, cultivated land, raised children, and sustained communities. Their influence was collective, layered, and anonymous. They changed the world not through singular moments, but through continuity. What survives instead of names is pattern. The layout of villages, the rhythm of agricultural seasons, the design of tools refined by countless hands. These are the true monuments of medieval life, created by people whose identities were never recorded, yet whose labor still echoes. Modern history struggles with this kind of invisibility. We search archives and find silence, and we mistake silence for emptiness. But medieval life was crowded with effort, fear, routine, and quiet endurance. It simply did not imagine a future audience. People lived without expecting to be remembered. There was no concept of legacy as we understand it today. Survival mattered more than memory. To leave children fed, land workable, and faith intact was enough. The idea that one's personal story should last beyond one's lifetime belonged to another world, one with surplus time and security. And so most medieval lives passed completely into obscurity, not because they were insignificant, but because significance was measured differently. Meaning existed in doing what was required, day after day, without applause or record. The world continued, and that continuation was proof enough that a life had mattered. What remains now are gaps, unnamed spaces between the events history chose to record. Those gaps are not empty. They are crowded with lives that once breathed, labored, hoped, and endured. Lives that shaped the ground we stand on, even if their names were never written. And as we look back across those centuries of silence, we begin to understand something quietly unsettling. The medieval world was not built by people who expected to be remembered. It was built by people who assumed they would not be and lived fully anyway. Moments of rest in a world that rarely paused. Rest in the medieval world did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, small, uneven pieces scattered between obligations, seasons, and survival. There were no long pauses, no extended escapes from labor. Life pressed forward with a steady weight, and rest existed only where it could be carefully carved out. Yet these moments, brief as they were, mattered deeply. They gave shape to endurance and allowed people to continue. Most days began with work before the body felt ready. Muscles stiff from the night were forced into motion by necessity. Fields did not wait. Animals did not understand fatigue. Fires had to be rekindled, water fetched, bread prepared. In this rhythm, rest was not the absence of labor, it was the easing of it. A slower pace in the late afternoon. A task set aside until tomorrow, if tomorrow could afford it. True stillness was rare. Even when hands were idle, minds were not. Hunger, weather, illness, and uncertainty lingered constantly. Rest, therefore, was often physical rather than mental. A body leaned against a fence while watching animals graze. A worker paused at the edge of a field, letting breath return before lifting the tool again. These pauses were not announced or scheduled. They were taken when the body demanded them and surrendered the moment work called again. Evenings offered a different kind of rest. As light faded, tasks narrowed. Work that required precision or strength gave way to quieter duties. Fires were tended rather than built. Food was eaten slowly, often in silence. Conversation, when it happened, was simple and unforced. Stories were short, familiar, and rarely dramatic. People rested not by escaping their lives, but by settling deeper into them. Night brought relief, but not comfort. Sleep came on hard surfaces, in shared spaces, interrupted by cold, noise, or worry. Yet lying down itself was a form of rest, a surrendered darkness and exhaustion. Dreams, when they came, were shaped by the same rhythms as waking life. Work, fear, repetition, even sleep was not fully separate from labor. The calendar offered rare collective pauses. Holy days, feast days, and seasonal celebrations interrupted routine just enough to be felt. Work slowed, sometimes stopped, but never disappeared entirely. Animals still needed care. Fires still burned. Yet these days carried a different atmosphere. Time loosened. Tasks were postponed without guilt. Rest became shared, and that sharing mattered. On such days, rest took on social meaning. People gathered not to be productive, but to be present. Food, though still simple, felt more generous. Music appeared unpolished, but alive. Laughter, when it surfaced, carried further than usual. These moments did not erase hardship, but they reminded people that life contained more than survival. Rest also existed in repetition. Familiar tasks performed without urgency could feel restful in their own way. spinning wool, mending tools, walking known paths. These activities required attention, but not strain. They allowed the mind to wander within safe boundaries. In a world full of uncertainty, familiarity itself became a refuge. Nature offered another kind of pause, watching weather move across the sky, sitting at the edge of a field after harvest, when the work was finally done, standing quietly at dawn or dusk when the world felt briefly balanced. These moments were not romanticized, but they were noticed. The land dictated labor, but it also offered permission to stop. Rest was often found in faith. Prayer structured time and created pauses that felt legitimate. To stop working in order to pray was not laziness, was obedience. In this way, belief protected moments of stillness. It gave people reasons to step away from labor without fear of judgment, even if only briefly. Age changed the shape of rest. The very young and the very old were allowed more stillness, though for different reasons. Children rested because they had not yet been absorbed fully into labor. The elderly rested because their bodies could no longer keep pace. In both cases, rest was conditional and temporary. The world did not slow for anyone for long. Illness forced rest, but rarely brought peace. Being unable to work created anxiety rather than relief. Rest taken unwillingly felt dangerous. It threatened survival and burdened others. True rest was acceptable only when it did not interfere with necessity. Perhaps the rarest form of rest was emotional. Moments when fear loosened its grip, when winter felt distant, when food was sufficient, when illness had passed and nothing urgent pressed in. These moments were subtle and fleeting, but they carried a quiet power. They reminded people that endurance was possible. What defines medieval rest is not its abundance, but its value. Because rest was scarce, it was felt more deeply. A pause was not wasted. Time it was recovery. Stillness was not emptiness, was preparation. And yet, even in these moments, the world never fully stopped. Rest existed alongside awareness that work would return, that demands would resume. This knowledge shaped every pause, making it careful, measured, and brief. Still, within those limits, people found ways to breathe, to slow, to exist without striving, if only for a moment. These fragments of rest, scattered through relentless days, held medieval life together more than any grand event ever could. And as we move closer to the final reflections of this story, it becomes clear that these small pauses, these nearly invisible moments of rest, were not interruptions to medieval life at all, but the quiet spaces that made continued endurance possible. How people found meaning without freedom or options. Meaning in the medieval world did not come from choice. For most people, choice barely existed at all. Life was inherited rather than designed, entered into rather than selected. You were born into a place, a family, a set of duties, and a narrow future that changed little from one generation to the next. And yet, within those limits, people still found meaning quietly, persistently, without ever naming it as such. Freedom, as we understand it today, was not expected. There was no assumption that life should offer multiple paths or personal fulfillment. Instead, meaning grew out of acceptance. To accept one's place was not seen as surrender, but as realism. The world was ordered by land, by labor, by faith, and resisting that order rarely led anywhere but hardship. Most people understood early what their lives would require of them. Children watched adults and learned not only tasks, but expectations. A farmer's child did not dream of becoming something else. The idea itself barely formed. Meaning came not from imagining alternatives, but from doing what had always been done, and doing it well enough to survive. Work was the first source of meaning, not because it was fulfilling, but because it was necessary. To contribute to produce food, tools, shelter was to justify one's presence in the community. Idleness carried moral weight. Work proved usefulness, and usefulness equaled worth. In a world with limited resources, meaning was closely tied to being needed. Competence mattered more than passion. To know how to plow straight rows, mend a net, bake bread that lasted, or keep animals alive through winter was to possess something valuable. These skills were learned slowly, passed down carefully, and practiced daily. Pride came not from innovation, but from reliability. Doing one's task correctly, again and again, was its own quiet achievement. Family offered another layer of meaning. Blood ties were not optional, but they were central. People measured their lives by who they supported and who depended on them. To raise children who survived, to care for aging parents, to maintain a household that endured from one year to the next. These responsibilities anchored identity more firmly than any personal ambition ever could. Marriage, often arranged or economically necessary, was not expected to deliver happiness. It delivered continuity, shared labor, shared survival, shared risk. Meaning emerged from endurance together, from weathering the same winters, losses, and routines side by side. Affection sometimes followed, but it was not required for a life to feel complete. Community reinforced meaning through expectation. Villages functioned because everyone knew their role. Deviating from it brought suspicion or punishment. Belonging depended on predictability. To be known was to be trusted, and to be trusted was to be safe. Meaning, therefore, came from fitting in rather than standing out. Faith provided the deepest framework for meaning in a world with few options. It explained suffering, justified hierarchy, and promised the order beyond human control. People did not ask whether they believed. Belief was assumed. Prayer, structured time, ritual marked life's transitions. Faith gave purpose to hardship by placing it within a larger story. Importantly, faith did not always comfort. It often demanded obedience and acceptance of pain, but it transformed uncertainty into something bearable. If suffering had meaning, then endurance was not pointless. This belief sustained people through losses they had no power to prevent. Meaning was also found in repetition. The same paths walked daily. The same prayers spoken morning and night. The same tasks completed in the same order. Repetition created stability in a world full of unpredictable threats. There was reassurance in knowing what tomorrow would ask of you, even if it asked too much. Nature shaped meaning as well. Seasons dictated effort and rest. Success or failure was often attributed to forces beyond control. Weather, soil, disease. People learned humility not as philosophy, but as necessity. Meaning came from working with the land rather than mastering it. Even suffering carried its own logic. Hunger, illness, and loss were not signs of failure, but shared experiences. Everyone endured them. Pain connected people rather than isolating them. Meaning emerged from knowing that one's hardship was not unique. Joy, when it appeared, was modest but intense. A good harvest. A healthy child. A shared meal. These moments mattered precisely because they were rare. They were not chased. They were received. Gratitude replaced aspiration. Perhaps most striking is that medieval People did not constantly question the purpose of their lives. Reflection, as a luxury, was limited. Life was lived forward, not examined from a distance. Meaning was embedded in action, not abstract thought. There was also meaning in limits themselves. Knowing where one belonged, what one could expect, and what one could not change reduced anxiety. Modern freedom brings possibility, but also uncertainty. Medieval limitation narrowed the world, but it made it legible. This does not mean medieval life was content or fair. Many suffered deeply. Many resented their position. But meaning did not require fairness, it required coherence. Life made sense within its own rules, however harsh those rules were. What is easy to forget is that people did not experience their lack of freedom as a philosophical problem. They experienced it as normal. Meaning was not something to be searched for. It was something already present, embedded in obligation, routine, and belief. And so, in a world with few options, meaning did not vanish. It settled into smaller spaces, into work done well, duties fulfilled, faith practiced, and survival achieved. As we move closer to the final reflection of this story, it becomes clear that medieval meaning was not loud or self-expressive. It was quiet, collective, and deeply rooted in necessity. And yet, beneath that acceptance, beneath that structure, there remained a fragile human awareness that life was brief, demanding, and irreversible. An awareness that shaped how meaning was held, protected, and passed on. A world forgotten, not because it was loud, but because it was normal. The medieval world did not disappear because it failed to matter. It disappeared because it blended too well into itself. Its days were not marked by constant upheaval, but by repetition. Its people did not expect transformation, only continuation. History, which favors disruption and spectacle, passed quietly over this world, not out of cruelty, but out of habit. What survives in memory are the sharp edges, wars, crowns, plagues, revolts. These moments rise above the surface because they break the pattern. But the pattern itself, the steady, ordinary rhythm of life, was far larger and far more enduring. It is this pattern that shaped centuries, yet left almost nothing behind that could be easily named or displayed. Most medieval days looked remarkably similar to one another. Morning followed night. Work followed hunger. Evening followed exhaustion. Life was not lived in chapters, but in loops. These loops rarely produced stories with beginnings and endings. They produced continuity, and continuity is difficult to remember once it ends. Normality was the medieval world's greatest strength and its greatest erasure. When something is shared by everyone, it stops being noticed. Mud on shoes, smoke in lungs, cold in winter, loss in families. These experiences were so universal that no one thought to record them. They were assumed, not observed. People did not wake each day thinking they were living in history. They woke thinking about weather, food, and tasks unfinished. The future did not stretch far ahead. It hovered just beyond the next season. When survival consumes attention, reflection becomes unnecessary. Life is lived forward, not framed. Even suffering, so visible to us now, was normalized then. Hardship did not signal crisis, it signaled life as expected. To be alive was to endure discomfort, uncertainty, and loss. This acceptance did not remove pain, but it prevented constant shock. The world was not cruel in contrast to expectation. It was difficult in alignment with it. This alignment is what makes the medieval world feel distant to us. Modern life trains us to notice difference, to track change, to document experience. Medieval life trained people to expect sameness. Progress was not assumed. Improvement was not guaranteed. The goal was not to move forward, but to hold on. Because of this, the medieval world left few sharp impressions. It did not announce itself. It accumulated quietly. Generations overlapped rather than replaced one another. Innovations spread slowly. Customs endured not because they were perfect, but because they worked well enough. Time moved differently, not measured in years or decades, but in harvests, rains, and remembered winters. Change happened, but it happened without urgency. When everything changes slowly, nothing feels dramatic, and without drama, memory loosens its grip. The people of this world did not imagine themselves as part of a period. They did not know they were medieval. They were simply alive. Labels are applied only after something ends. While life continues, it resists being named. This is why the medieval world feels quiet when we look back at it. Not because nothing happened, but because so much happened in ways that did not demand attention. Lives were lived fully, but not loudly. Meaning was found, but not proclaimed. Endurance mattered more than expression. Even joy was understated. It arrived in small, manageable forms: enough food, a surviving child, a shared evening. These moments did not explode into celebration. They settled gently into memory, then faded as new needs arrived. Happiness was not something to be chased. It was something to notice briefly before returning to work. And yet, this quiet world built the foundations of everything that followed. Roads worn by countless feet. Fields shaped by generations of labor. Social structures hardened through repetition. Languages stabilized. Traditions rooted themselves deeply enough to survive centuries. Modern life often feels louder not because it is fuller, but because it records itself constantly. Every moment is framed, stored, compared. The medieval world had no such mirror. Once a moment passed, it belonged only to those who had lived it. Forgetting, then, was not a failure of memory. It was the natural outcome of a life designed around presence rather than preservation. People did not live to be remembered. They lived to continue. And continuation does not require witnesses beyond its own time. When we search for medieval life and find silence, we should not mistake that silence for emptiness. It is dense with unrecorded existence. It holds millions of lives that did not demand recognition, yet shaped the world more profoundly than any single event. This forgotten world reminds us of something unsettling and necessary. That most human life, even now, unfolds outside the spotlight of history. That meaning does not require attention. That endurance does not need applause. The medieval world was not erased by time. It simply stepped aside as something louder replaced it. Its quiet was not weakness, but completeness. It did not argue for its importance. It assumed it, and perhaps that is why it feels so distant today. We live in a world that constantly asks to be seen, remembered, validated. The medieval world asked only to persist. As we reach the end of this story, what remains is not a list of events, but a sense of a world that moved slowly, accepted limits, and found stability within repetition. A world that did not disappear because it lacked substance, but because it was too ordinary to announce itself. It was forgotten not because it was loud, but because it was normal. And in that normality, it carried humanity forward, quietly, for centuries. By the end of the Middle Ages, kingdoms rose and fell. Borders shifted. New eras slowly replaced the old. But for most people, very little ever changed. They lived quietly, worked until they were tired, and passed their lives without expecting history to remember them. And in many ways, that is the story we rarely tell. History often remembers what was loud, what was violent, what was exceptional. But the medieval world was mostly built from ordinary days, repeated again and again by people who never imagined they would be remembered at all. And yet, it was their lives quiet, unnoticed, and routine that carried the world forward. If this story felt slow, that's because life back then was slow. And sometimes, the most honest history is the kind that barely seems to happen.